Mr. President, during the recent government shutdown, there were a lot of budget issues that were negotiated. It's a wide-ranging bill of over 1,000 pages when it was all said and done. But the most contentious number in all of the negotiations circled around a barrier on our southern border in the highest drug trafficking corridor in the country. The President requested $5.7 billion to build a barrier fence in 10 locations that the Customs and Border Patrol had identified as the top 10 points of illegal drugs entering our country. Now, that study had been requested by Congress before. They fulfilled that study of identifying the highest profile drug trafficking corridors, brought that back to Congress. The President then requested funding to be able to build fencing in those areas of the highest trafficking areas. His request was not for a 2,000-mile-long wall. It was only to replace some of the sections of the 650-mile-long barrier that already exists, areas that were old and ineffective, or to be able to put new fencing in high drug trafficking areas. In a highly partisan debate, Congress eventually appropriated $1.375 billion to DHS for the construction of additional barriers, not even close to what the President and what Customs and Border Patrol said they needed to protect the nation and members of law enforcement. During those negotiations, the President announced that he would declare a national emergency if he didn't get the funds needed to secure the nation. At that point, there are two options for people who don't want the President to secure our border. One is include language in that appropriations bill before it's passed to prevent the President from declaring an emergency action and using any of the funds for that. The second one is wait till after the bill is passed and declare a disapproval resolution to stop the President after the bill is already passed. Those who oppose border security chose the second option, fight the President after passage, which brings us to today. After signing the funding bill to reopen the government, to deal with the humanitarian crisis and the flow of illegal narcotics coming into our country, the President declared a national emergency in two areas. He has over 100 authorities. He declared it in two. One was this. He wanted to be able to replace some of the National Guard members with members of the reserve. You have to declare a national emergency to call up the reserve members to do that. So his first request was call up some of the reserves to swap out with some of the Guard members already serving at the border. The second one was in one of the accounts that deals with military construction, if needed, he wanted to be able to tap into some of those funds. Now, he was also very clear, there are 4 accounts that they would have access to in this. 3 of them don't need an emergency declaration. Let me run through those. The first is the $1.375 billion that Congress allocated in the government shutdown ending debate. No question, $1.375 has been approved by Congress. There's a second fund where there's $600 million. It's in the Treasury Asset Forfeiture Fund. That fund specifically notes that those funds can be used for any use for federal law enforcement. It's very clear. It has wide discretion, any use for federal law enforcement. So no legal question that it can be used by Customs and Border Patrol or to be able to do construction of any kind of barrier. A third fund that exists already with the Department of Defense. There's $4 billion in this fund set aside, and it can be used for wide-ranging issues dealing with counter-narcotics. No question that the President can do any action dealing with counter-narcotics with that certain fund. In fact, in that fund itself, the specific language is already included in that, and this is up to $4 billion, saying construction of roads and fences, installation of lighting to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries of the United States. So let me run through this. There's up to $4 billion the President can ask for. He doesn't have to ask for emergency authority at all on. That's the counter-narcotics, counter-drug smuggling. There's the $600 million that have already been allocated that the President can use because it deals with law enforcement. There's $1.375 billion that Congress also allocated. There is no legal question on any of those. At the tail end of that, the White House has also said after all 3 of those funds are expended, which, by the way, those 3 funds exceed the $5.7 billion the President says he needs. The President's request is, if we go through all of those and are not able to close that section down, I want to be able to access at some future point this other fund. Now, they've also made it very clear that would be past October. That would not even be in this fiscal year. So really the debate about funding is a next year's issue on any what's called the 2808 funding on the military construction. Leaving us again to today. An emergency declaration really has two questions in it. Is it an emergency? And does the president have statutory authority to take this action? That's the only two questions on the table. Is it an emergency is under dispute. There are some folks that would say, I don't think what's going on the border is an emergency. There are some folks, some in this chamber, some in the other chamber, that want to abolish ICE, that want to dismantle the wall, that want to be able to open the borders. Thankfully, that's a small group of people that don't see our national security as important. For the vast majority of folks, they do see an importance in doing national security from Congress and on our borders. Then we have the argument about how serious is this? I've had folks that said to me, it's really not that bad because we have individuals coming, but not as high of a number as what it used to be. 20 years ago, we even had more people crossing the border illegally. That's not the question that's in front of us. The request from Customs and Border Patrol is specifically for the 10 areas with the highest drug trafficking in all of our southern border. That's the request. The question is, do we have an emergency dealing with illegal drugs crossing our border after the Customs and Border Patrol have said to us, we need barriers to slow down the flow of illegal drugs? Are they right or are they wrong? Among those areas, in the Rio Grande Valley sector is the highest area for movement right now of illegal drugs crossing into our country. It's 16% of the border miles, but it's 40% of the illegal border and illegal drug trafficking coming in. Just in that one sector last year, 550 pounds of methamphetamine were seized. This is not at the port of entry, this is between ports of entry in that open area that doesn't have a fence. 550 pounds of methamphetamines, 1,500 pounds of cocaine, 64,000 pounds of marijuana were seized in that one section without a fence. The question is that an emergency? 70,000 Americans died last year from overdoses from drugs that came from and through Mexico. 70,000. If we had any issue in America where 70,000 people died, I can assure you this Congress would stand up and say, we have an emergency. But for some reason, there is dispute whether it's important we stop the flow of illegal drugs coming from Mexico into the United States. I don't think that should be in dispute. To give an example of really how fast this is changing and how much of an emergency this is, people would say this has been going on for years. Why is it different now? Just in the last 2 years, between ports of entry, again, not at the ports of entry, in that open area where there is no barrier, between ports of entry, our Customs and Border Patrol seized last year 388 pounds of fentanyl. Now that may not sound like much, but only a couple of grains of it, as in a couple of grains of sand, is enough to kill a person. Fentanyl is highly addictive and exceptionally powerful drug, 100 times more powerful than morphine. It is being laced into heroin, laced into cocaine, and it is a mass killer. Almost 25,000 people in the country last year died from an overdose of fentanyl. Knowing it only takes 2 or 3 grains to be too much to kill a person, 388 pounds of it was seized between ports of entry along our border. To tell you how it's accelerated, that is a 269% increase in 2 years of fentanyl being captured between ports of entry. Yes, we have an emergency. Yes, we have people dying in this country due to overdoses from fentanyl, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines. And the problem is not static. The problem is accelerating. Last year, we had one of the highest rates of picking up cocaine between ports of entry that has ever existed in our country. Last year, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol seized 11,000 pounds total of methamphetamine coming across that border, the highest year ever coming across our border. Undeniably, there's an emergency. The question is, do we agree or disagree that when a statute says that a president has the ability to do a construction, that he means he can also construct a barrier? I believe it does. Those two questions: is it an emergency? Does the statutory authority exist? Interestingly enough, there's some of my friends that are adding in a third question: should the president have that authority? Now, that's a different question, and I understand that question. Interestingly enough, just a few hours ago, the President of the United States tweeted, as he's infamous for doing, he tweeted out and said, if Congress wants to discuss, should a president have this authority in the future, I'm open to discussing that. But that's not pertaining to today. I think that's an interesting question that we should address as a nation. What and how broad should an executive authority be for any president? But the debate we have today is plain and simple. Is it an emergency? Does the president in current law have statutory authority? My answer to both of those things is yes. And I hope that we continue to do drug interdiction, continue to be able to work through the issues that need to be addressed, continue to do recovery, continue to be able to help people that are fighting through addiction, because we need a healthy nation and also a secure nation. So for those 10 areas that are the highest drug trafficking areas in the entire country, I hope we close those doors. And I hope we protect lives in the days ahead. And I'm going to choose to oppose a resolution of disapproval today that the president doesn't have the authority to be able to protect the American people. With that, I yield the floor.